Me? Hi, I'm Janet King. I'm the Executive Director for the Community Fund of Darien. I've been in the position about 6 weeks, so bear with me. Okay. We're going to start with a slide explaining why we're here and why the Thriving Youth Task Force is a part of the Community Fund of Darien. So bear with me. Mallory set me up. So what is the Community Fund? Well, it's 63 years old. It's about living local and giving local. We're here to enhance the community by caring for each other. We support our neighboring communities as well as the town of Darien. We are about intelligent and informed philanthropy. We raise money to support our local community through a grants process, which a lot of folks don't know what that's about, but we identify critical needs every 3 years that need our help, that need our funding. And those assessments take place every 3 years, and I believe they started, was it last year, this new set? Anyway, it's basic needs, youth success, and self-sufficiency are what we focus on. More than 60 volunteers research and interview nonprofit agencies before we give out any of the money. So it's very intelligently thought through and thoughtfully thought through. A local initiative is the Human Services Planning Council, which you see on the left, which the Community Fund organized and led. Are you ready for this? They've led it since the 1920s. So through that, it's a collective of more than 40 nonprofit, governmental, and educational leaders who discuss and develop plans to address social service needs in Darien. The topic of discussion for many years was our youth. So in 2008, the Thriving Youth Task Force was created. And the task force founding purpose is to convene these community organizations together to promote and empower positive youth development, which is why we're all here tonight. So the task force began surveying Darien students in grades 7 through 12 to get baseline data in 2008. I have to switch this slide, hold on. In 2008. We used the Search Institute, and if you haven't visited their website, I encourage you to. It is a wonderful website, which actually, it started back with the Lutheran Church, believe it or not, and they set up these 40 developmental assets, which they've studied extensively. So this is the 4th round of the survey, which is taken every 3 years. The Community Fund became eligible for a 5-year grant from the state, which was received in 2015. Ingrid Gillespie, where are you? You moved around, from Communities for Action is the one who wrote the grant and submitted it on behalf of the Community Fund. That allowed us to expand the program and to hire a full-time person to run it, which is Emily Larkin. She has implemented a 5-year strategic plan to address underage drinking because that is the most prevalent substance abuse amongst Darien teens. So we've developed an evaluation plan and a strategy, and we have short and long-term outcomes, which we're measuring. So we measure our progress through community-wide survey. Simply put, 7th through 12th grade students in Darien take the survey every 3 years. The parents receive an emailed survey every 2 years. So we are very grateful for the support of the Darien Public School System and the Board of Education who allow us to do the survey in the schools. We're going to talk more in detail about the survey this evening, but I wanted to give you that background so you know how it all came about. I'm going to introduce Susanna Lewis, who's been working with the Community Fund and Thriving Youth Task Force for the past year. She's compiled Darien's local needs assessment on the opioid epidemic, and then on the analysis of the 2018 student data. She's the Director of Community Relations and Clinical Outreach at Silver Hill Hospital, and holds her MPH in Epidemiology from Columbia University. Suzanne is a Darien resident and also serves on the RTM's Public Health and Safety Committee. I'm also going to introduce Allison Johnson, who received her undergraduate degree in psychology from Middlebury College, her MBA from Duke University. She's worked in the healthcare field for more than 15 years, first as a management consultant, and then in internal strategy roles at Pfizer. Allison has 2 elementary school children and has been volunteering for the Community Fund since moving to Darien in 2013. We're also going to have Annie Eriks, who is our Youth Asset Team co-president at Darien High School Senior, and soon to be a Wake Forest freshman, She'll be moderating our panel of 3 experts this evening.
So short and long-term outcomes of all of this survey work, which, as Janet said, has been going on for some years now. Shorter term, we're looking to increase the number of parents who report understanding the difference between the adult and teen brain, an increase in the number of parents who know the consequences of breaking social host laws, and an increase in parent dialogue with teens about underage drinking and substance use. Longer term outcomes that we're looking at are a reduction in past 30-day use for young people aged 12 to 17, an increase in youth perception of parental disapproval around these risky substance use behaviors, an increase in perception of risk themselves around these behaviors, and a reduction in 11th and 12th grade past 30-day use. And you'll see when we get into the data that it is by 11th and 12th grade that the numbers are most pronounced, and that there is the greatest prevalence of substance use. So what we're going to talk about tonight, the results of the 2018 survey, including developmental assets and substance use rates among young people in Darien. Allison is going to talk about the parent survey data, which looked at parent perceptions and attitudes regarding substance use rates in Darien. And then we've got a great panel put together who will help us figure out what sense to make of all the data and where we go next. Okay, so an important note about the student data. As Janet mentioned, all students are surveyed. Parents do have the option to opt their students out of the survey. None of the parents did that in Darien, and so we have all student data for everyone who was in school the day the survey was implemented. So that gives us a participation rate somewhere in the 90s, which is kind of unheard of. So that's super. And then the survey was, there were 2 parts of the survey. So there was the portion that asked about these developmental assets that Janet referenced. And then the second portion concerned sort of use of particular substances, risk perception, motivation around substance use. The reason for starting with this asset piece is that is the basically the evidence and research-based framework through which all of the substance use data that we've been gathering for the last 10 years or so is interpreted and analyzed. And put most simply, the premise is that the more of these developmental assets that a young person possesses, the less likely they are to be engaging in risk-taking behaviors, and the more likely they are to be flourishing socially and emotionally. So the first, and you can see on the screen sort of how those categories break down in terms of what they're looking at in youth development. So, and then the pie chart here is the Darien student data itself, which these are composite scores for all of the different asset categories. And basically what it indicates is that about 50% of our students are vulnerable or challenged, and about 50% of them are doing okay or thriving. And that data we know from the Search Institute is pretty on par with demographically peer communities to Darien, just to sort of give you a little benchmark. And one of our panelists is going to talk a little bit more about some of these asset categories. So then going to the substance use data. A really interesting data point that we had this year for the first time were vaping figures, which are really instructive to look at alongside cigarette use. So, I mean, this is 2014 versus 2018. Cigarette use 30-day prevalence had already decreased substantially. but we can see that by 2018, it dropped that much more. However, about 37% of 12th graders reported vaping within the last 30 days. So that more than makes up for the share, the decreased proportion of cigarette smoking, and indeed is higher than cigarette smoking rates were back in 2014. Alcohol, overall 30-day prevalence, there was a drop, but the figure is still quite high. It was about 61% for 12th grade 30-day prevalence. Marijuana, this is sort of a little bit of a question mark point. It appears that there was a decrease, but you can vape marijuana. And the survey did not ask what students were vaping. It just asked if they were vaping. So we don't actually know whether that decrease is artifactual in the data or whether there actually is a decrease there. And then prescription pills, which you can see from the other substances, not the most prevalent substance. However, we know both from the survey data and from more qualitative data that we gathered during the opioid needs assessment that specifically prescription amphetamine rates of abuse there are very, very high. So students and adults reporting use of prescription amphetamines non-medicinally for performance enhancement. So that's, even though overall the rates are low, there's a story within that data. And then risk perception among 12th graders. And we look at that because that's an important predictor of behavior. One of the cigarette data itself did not make it onto this slide, so I'm going to tell you. Risk perception was very high around cigarette smoking. It was 67.5%. However, that was lower than 2014 when it was 74.5%. So there was high risk perception, but lower than 2014. And when you compare the 67.5% to the 19.1% for e-cigarettes, it's clear that we have a lot of education to do. The next piece of really interesting information here was risk perception around drinking, and specifically kind of moderate everyday drinking, a huge increase in risk perception, but actually a decrease in risk perception around having 5 or more drinks once or twice a week, which by definition is binge drinking. So that's another piece where the education that sort of the task force is involved in and all of that, there's more work to do there and more fine-tuning of that work. And then using marijuana more than once a week. Risk perception decreased. So we saw that there was a reported decrease in marijuana smoking, but there's also a decrease in risk perception, and we don't know about the vaping piece. So that's a little bit inconclusive. And then perception of parental disapproval, because that's another important predictor of behavior. Cigarettes and prescription drug misuse were the highest. And also right up there was the 1 to 2 drinks per day, so the moderate daily drinking. And yet, if you look all the way over on the right for you, students' perception of parental disapproval of having 4 or more drinks in one sitting was notably lower. So across the board, that's clearly an area where more work is needed. And then using e-cigarettes and marijuana use, it was not the most pronounced, but still pretty substantial in terms of perception of parental disapproval. And And then patterns of consumption. The first interesting thing here to know in each of these sort of categories is the jump from 11th to 12th grade. So there are different, in the survey data from 6th grade through 12th grade, we see big jumps in sort of prevalence between 8th and 9th grade, and then also between 11th and 12th. So students reporting having 4 or more drinks per episode in the last 30 days went from 37% among 11th graders to 54% among 12th graders, so a majority. Those reporting having 4 or more drinks in one setting went from 35 to 42%, which is a pretty substantial number. And drinking 4 or more times a month increased by 11%. So a third of our 12th graders are saying that they're drinking more than weekly. Just to benchmark that against some national data, and this is data that's public and available, nationally, 24% of 12th graders reported 4 or more drinks in the past 30 days. So that's an area where our young people are regrettably exceeding the averages. And then motivations for drinking among those students who did report alcohol use. The top 5 reasons were friends or peer pressure, to have fun, to relieve stress and feel better, the availability of alcohol, and curiosity. And in our we've presented this data in a couple of settings before, and people have asked us, well, can you rank those 1 to 5? The way the question was asked, we can't, but across grade levels, all of these reasons were the top 5, and for males and females both. And then top 4 self-reported reasons not to drink, so deterrence. And then the data was broken out both between students reporting alcohol use and also students reporting that they did not use alcohol. And in both groups, students widely reported sort of punitive consequences of drinking. So parental rules, ID checking, breathalyzers, license suspension. The notable difference was among students not reporting alcohol use, was that peer behavior, the fact that their friends were not drinking, was a motivating factor for them not to be drinking. And that actually, so friends don't drink. So that's, we know anecdotally that who your kids hang out with matters, but it's right there in the data. So there's a lot more than that, but that's the gist. And the full data set is available to anybody who would like to see it. But the key takeaways, vaping, cigarette use has decreased, but vaping has become quite prevalent. Students are perceiving high risk and high parental disapproval around moderate daily drinking, but not around weekly binge drinking. Marijuana use appears to have decreased, but we don't know whether the prevalence has actually increased in the form of vaping. And the other important thing to note about marijuana as a substance is that it was the highest correlate for use of any other illicit substance in this data set. So basically, students who did report marijuana use across the board were more likely to report using other illicit substances. So the gateway phenomenon is really real there. Then the importance of peer groups as a deterrent among students who are choosing not to drink. And then finally, that amphetamines are the most common prescription drug used non-medicinally. And this, of course, is student data, but we know from other data that's been gathered that that's actually true of adults in Darien as well. So that is the student piece, and Allison. I'll give this to you.
Okay, so I'm going to present the parent survey data. So this is the second time that this survey has been administered to parents in Darien. It was the same survey tool that was used in the fall of 2016, so we now have 2018 data, which is good because we can start to see some progress. This year was the first time that the parent survey was fielded at the same time as the student survey, so it allows us to look and make some comparisons between parent perception and what the students are reporting. So we will be showing you some of that data. And for the parents, there were 540 parent responses. That's a high number compared to other towns who get a similar survey tool. And it also is deemed a high enough number to produce some reliable results. So with that, we'll start with this slide because this is parent perception of 30-day substance use. And I will start here and then move on to show you how this compares to what the student said. So first thing to note is that you can see that the rise in alcohol use in grades 11 through 12 is very substantial. 50% of parents thought that their 11th or 12th grader had used alcohol in the past 30 days. Second to note, similar to what you saw from the student data, use of e-cigarettes is higher in all age groups than either use of marijuana or cigarette smoking. Comparing parent perception of alcohol use to the student data, first point to note is that it's probably starting earlier than some of us as parents think. In 9th grade, only 3% of parents thought that their child had drank alcohol in the past 30 days. The students reported 15%. 10th grade seems to be the year when it starts to become more common. Close to a third of 10th graders reported drinking in the past 30 days. Parents thought that that number was 20%. And then 11th and 12th grade, the numbers are pretty similar between what parents thought and what the youths reported. So parents are aware, or I should say more aware, that it's happening in the later grades. For marijuana use in the past 30 days, the discrepancy seems to be in the older grades. Parent perception for juniors and seniors at around 10 to 14%, whereas the students are reporting that that's actually closer to 20 to 30% use in the past 30 days. And vaping has the biggest gap of them all. One reason may be because it's harder to detect when your child comes home if they have been vaping. But again, if you look at the 10th grade numbers, 7% of parents thought that their child had vaped in the past 30 days. The students reported 20%. And for 11th to 12th grades, parents perceived 15 to 20%. And for 12th graders, the number was as high as 38%, saying that they had vaped in the past 30 days. So we wanted to take a closer look at the issue of juniors and seniors drinking and the prevalence that increases when you look at drinking more sporadically at once or twice a month. So the question was asked of parents, do you think that these behaviors cause harm, physical or otherwise, to your child? And they were asked to rank slight, moderate, up to the great risk of harm. So you can see with the bars that drinking alcohol 1 to 2 times a day or smoking marijuana once a week, the numbers are very high. Parents say, yes, that definitely poses a great risk of harm to my child. But when you get down to drinking alcohol 1 to 2 times a month, the number drops to just below 40%. The problem with that perception is that what we saw from the student data is that those infrequent episodes usually are binge drinking, which does come with its hosts of risks. Secondly, the teen brain is not developed until the mid-20s. So drinking and binge drinking, even for juniors and seniors, actually does scientifically pose a risk of harm. And so there's more education that's needed in this area. We asked parents, what factors do you think play a lead role in a teen's behavior regarding alcohol? They told us that 4 factors matter: family expectations, influence of friends, family rules, and parent behavior. So interestingly, 3 of the 4 of these are directly tied to parental influence, and the numbers sharply decreased. All of these were in the 70 to 80% of ranked very important. The numbers sharply declined for all of the external factors, even legal consequences. And the message here kind of screamed loud and clear that parents in our community believe that what they say and do matters. And that's a positive thing. So knowing that family rules and expectations are important, we wanted to see how many families have clear rules discouraging the use of alcohol. We saw in the 2016 survey that clear family rules decreased as kids got older. So you can see that in grades 9 and 10, 70% of families reported having clear rules, and that dropped to 50% by the time their kids were juniors and seniors. The problem is that that's exactly the time when we see kids reporting that they drink more and more. So you have kids drinking more, parents loosening up on their rules, and that's not a good combination. So for 2018, we were pleased to see that across all age groups, the percentage of parents saying that they had clear rules discouraging the use of alcohol for their kids went up. And most importantly, for grades 11 and 12, it went from 50% to 68%. Not surprisingly, data this year again showed a very involved patient community. Nearly 80% of high school parents reported having recent and regular conversation with their kids about drugs and alcohol. For middle schoolers, the question was asked, have you had a conversation in the past 3 months? And again, just over 80% of middle school parents said they had. Also, when asked if parents thought their children would speak to them if they had a serious concern, the number was also 80%. And I just wanted to close with some specific data points that relate back to the short-term goals that are being measured as part of the grant. All of these are movements in the right direction from the previous survey. We're now at 93% of parents stating that they know the social hosting law that specifically states that minors are prohibited from possessing alcohol in a private home. 80 to 95% of parents expressed having some or a lot of knowledge on the effects of alcohol on the teen brain. And we talked about the increase in families having clear rules for alcohol. On the other side, numbers that we wanted to see go down, 17% of parents this time reported that teens consumed alcohol in their homes. That number was down from 24% in the 2016 survey. And 4% of parents reported serving teens other than their child in their homes. That number was down from 7%. So key takeaways from the parent survey, the teens in our community are using alcohol more than we think and earlier than we think. Second, there's still a certain degree of acceptance for teen drinking socially. Some progress has been made, but we think there's still more that should be done. And then third, we have our parent community very involved, and there's an opportunity to continue to engage the parents and to keep the trends moving in the right direction. The progress that has been made is a result of a lot of different groups. So the Thriving Youth Task Force is a collaboration amongst all of these organizations that all bring presentations and knowledge and support to the community, all working towards a common goal. And with that, I am going to introduce Annie, who is going to introduce our panel. She's a Darien senior and co-president of the Youth Asset Team.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Annie Eriks. I serve as co-president of the Youth Asset Team, as well as co-president of the the Depot Student Governing Board. I just want to thank you all for coming out here tonight. We really appreciate it on this Tuesday evening. The fact that you are here tonight says so much about you as a parent. You care about your kids and want to learn about the challenges they're facing and how you can help. Now that we've heard the survey data, the next question is, what do we do with it? We have assembled a panel of 3 experts tonight that will help you interpret the data and think about your next steps. I would like to welcome all 3 of our panelists and share a little bit about them. First, we have John Hamilton, who is a 30-year industry veteran and expert in the field of addiction treatment and prevention. He is currently the Chief Clinical Officer for Mountainside, and next week will begin a new role as the CEO of Liberation Programs. He has consulted for the National Institute for Drug Abuse, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration, and currently chairs the advisory board for the Connecticut Department of Mental Health and Addiction Services. Next, I would like to welcome Dr. Tara S. Levinson, who has been working in the field of child development, education, and mental health for the past 20 years. She holds a doctoral degree in pediatric and school psychology and a master's degree in special education from Lehigh University. She's a licensed psychologist and a nationally certified school psychologist. Dr. Levinson is a published author and a regular presenter in her field. She currently has an active private practice in Westport, Connecticut, and continues to consult with families, schools, and foundations in Australia, Asia, and the UK. Finally, I would like to welcome Georgette Harrison, who earned her Master of Arts and Master of Education degrees in Counseling Psychology from Teachers College, Columbia University, and holds an infant parent mental health postgraduate certificate from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. She is the Director of Clinical and Community Partnerships for the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut, where, as part of her role, she provides psychotherapy to Darien children and their families. So I'd like to welcome our panelists to the front of the room. Now, after hearing this data, I'd like to open the room up to questions, too. Oh, after the panelists.
Thank you, Annie. That's unbelievable, right? When I was in high school, I could barely talk, and you were so articulate. I actually got up one talk in high school, and I fell off the stage. Then I made the mistake of telling my wife that, so every time I'm presenting, she said, good luck tonight, John. Try not to fall off the stage. But you were amazing, Annie. That's incredible. The kids are so poised today. Do you know the greatest predictor of binge drinking in college is participation in sports in high school? Pretty amazing, right? Team sports specifically. But we'll save that for the questions. I have a couple of slides here, right, Emily, to get through these slides. Why do people do drugs? This actually comes from NIDA's research, a federal agency that's responsible for all the brain research, 85% of all the research of addiction in the world, actually. And people do drugs for 2 reasons: feel good or to feel better. I mean, it seems kind of trite, wow, John, this is 30 years in the industry. This is all you can come up with. But it actually has profound implications, because the individuals that are doing drugs and alcohol to feel good are probably going to get through life unscathed. These are people that are sharing experiences with each other and connecting in the context of connecting with their peers. It doesn't mean tragedy doesn't occur even in the first use. But these are not the people we're seeing at Liberation Programs or Silver Hill or Mountainside or any of our programs that actually serve people that become harmfully involved with substance use disorder. Those are individuals that are doing drugs to feel better. They may have started doing drugs to feel good, but ultimately everyone comes into our doors because they're doing drugs to feel better. And now it is really about disconnection. Disconnection to their body, disconnection to their emotions, disconnection to their family, disconnection to their feelings. The kids in middle school and grammar school, teachers can identify with alexithymia, which is a fancy word. Anybody ever heard of alexithymia? You would know an emotion if it pitch in the arm. And you could see a kid coming down the hall really tense, and I'd be like, Tara, what's the matter? It's oh, I'm having a good day. Or little Billy's walking down the hall. Billy, how's your day? Oh, I'm okay. And everyone else can see he's depressed. These are kids that are disconnected to their feelings. They go to their first overnight party, they start to vape, they have a couple of drinks, and they will explain to you that they've never felt so alive. That's a big red flag, because now that's going to be a primer effect. It's going to wet their whistle to come back and feel alive again, because they're disconnected to their feelings. A lot of other kids are just not comfortable in their own skin. and they have anxiety, they might have some issues around abuse and trauma, depression. They're just not comfortable in their own skin. These are the individuals and kids that are at great risk. And as you know, we have an opiate epidemic. 174 Americans die every day from a drug overdose. However, if you factor in the alcohol-related deaths each day, it jumps up to 415. By the way, I'm not the pick-me-up part of the conversation. My colleagues, Tara and Georgette, are going to give you a glimmer of hope. I'm just setting the stage to get you really depressed, and then they'll give you the hope, because it is all about resiliency. It's all about assets in the community and individual. And as a family therapist, I'm a big fan of that. The heroin addiction, as I mentioned and touched upon, people are not just coming off the streets in Darien and getting involved in heroin. In fact, what puts them at risk? In the bigger picture, increased exposure to drugs at an early age increases risk. Increased exposure to toxic stress also increases risk, if people are familiar with the Adverse Childhood Experience study. And increased exposure to certain drugs will also increase risk. So if a kid is misusing alcohol, that doubles the chance that they will have a problem and get involved in heroin. If that kid is using marijuana, there's 3 times likely chance that that kid will eventually get involved in heroin. Cocaine, now it propels to 15 times greater chance of getting involved in heroin if a kid gets involved in cocaine. And if a kid is involved in opiate analgesic prescription drugs, like Percocet and Oxycontin, that now jumps to 40 times greater chance of having a problem with heroin. In fact, new heroin-addicted individuals, 85% of the new addicted individuals on heroin started their misuse with prescription drugs and now became involved in heroin. And now we're trying to do what we can to restrict that use of prescription drugs. But an unintended consequence is if we restrict the supply, we haven't really factored in the demand. So an unintended consequence is there's a cohort of those individuals that were misusing substances such as Oxycontin and Percocet now have been cut off from their supply of that, and now that they have a dependence, they go to the streets for heroin. What is the actual addicted potential of different drugs? So what we have here, and you can see here the pointer, tobacco, people can hear this, right? 32%. It's actually more addicting for exposure to the general population than heroin. Heroin, for the general population exposed to heroin, 23% of individuals will become addicted. Cocaine, 17%. Alcohol, 15%. Sedatives, 9%. And cannabis for the general population, 9%. But John Bassel's here in the room looking, John, those numbers seem a little low. But wait, John, there's more. If the age of onset is below 18, as was said by my colleague Allison earlier, increased exposure increases risk at an early age. That age of onset is below 18 years of age, you add 17% to every one of those numbers, right? Now Ingrid, where's Ingrid? Ingrid Gillespie, still a little suspect, and I see Amy saying, well, those numbers still seem maybe a little low. But wait, there's more. If the person starts before the age of 15, right? Right, Amy's nodding her head. That increased exposure at 15, now you add 25 to 50% of risk of dependency on all those numbers. So for instance, an individual who starts vaping at 14 will have an 82% chance of becoming dependent on tobacco in their life. We know about the neuroplasticity of the brain. People are familiar with that, how it develops. People used to think the brain was completely developed at 18. Now we know it completely develops at 24 for women and 25 for men. Some men maybe 40, but we don't have time to get into that. You know, we're not here to judge. But the idea here is it starts at the reptilian part of the brain, which is the basic needs, and the last part of the brain is the prefrontal lobe, which is that part of the brain that's decision-making and judgment and impulse control, which is all not yet developed for adolescents. And some would argue, as the adults in the community in Darien, we are their prefrontal lobe. We're the ones that have to be able to offer that. Perfect example is the shark study, little focus group. Here we got maybe 1 or 2 students here, but mostly adults. So the library has set up a lovely shark tank right outside. So after our presentation, people will have an opportunity to jump in the shark tank with sharks. What do you think, Emily? Are you up for it? Nope. Anybody up for it? Never disappoints. People shaking their head. What are you kidding? Because you have prefrontal lobes that are working. Never disappoints. The adults never raise their hand. We go to Darien High School tomorrow in a group forum at the auditorium, and Bob Francis did this in the Bridgeport area, and ask kids in high school, hey, outside the hall, we have a shark tank. Who's game? You will have a significant number of students raising their hands, seriously. And they always have 3 common questions. The first is, has the shark just been fed? And the second is, will I be bleeding at the time? But my favorite is the third. Can I bring a friend in to distract the shark? Never once does a kid raise their hand and say, you know what? On second thought, that's not a good career move. I mean, who has adolescents at home? People in the room, right? Did you ever have a conversation with your adolescent on a Friday afternoon or early Friday evening to come up to you and say, you know, Mom, on second thought, I don't think I'm going to go to that party tonight because it might include some high-risk behaviors, and that might be a really bad career move for me. So let's stay home and watch This Is Us. What do you think? I mean, it's maybe something you want them to say, but they don't have that. So again, we become their prefrontal lobe. The message that I'm sending, which is my segue to my colleagues, is that we do have hope. What we know about neuroplasticity in the brain, what we know about brain development, is that increased exposure at an early age increases risk. So every year a substance is delayed, the risk of developing a substance use disorder is reduced. So for instance, we have very clear data that if a young adult starts drinking at the age of 14 without even looking at genetics, and we know it's an interplay of genetics and environment, they start drinking at the age of 14, they have a 40% chance of having a problem with alcohol in their lifetime. But if we push back to have them have their first age onset at 16, that cuts in half. From 16 to 18, it cuts in half again. And at the age of 21, if you have your young adult have their first drink on the legal age in all 50 states, at 21, they have less than a 7% chance of having a problem with alcohol in their lifetime. So there is hope. There is hope to continue to have conversations. We'll get that into the questions and answers. But there's hope of what we know, that if we can delay that age onset, we can, while that brain is developing, we can help protect that brain and help it become more resilient and help our kids short-term and long-term. Thank you.
So Tara and I are going to go back and forth in this particular segment of the presentation. So if you will excuse the fact that we will stay seated for it. So just a quick refresher. Let's say you are one of the parents that has had this conversation with your kids. You've talked about why there's clear rules and boundaries around alcohol use. You don't want to see your kids using alcohol or marijuana or prescription drugs that haven't been prescribed for them. This still applies to you. Because one of the reasons why the framework that we're using is the developmental assets is because kids who have a greater number of developmental assets, they thrive. And this cuts across all domains of their life. So it's not just about not engaging in risky behavior. This is about helping them make good choices. And if we remember the data from earlier, that one of the biggest predictors for kids not drinking was hanging out with people who were not drinking. The more developmental assets you have, that impacts your peer choice. So this is one of the reasons why even if you're having these conversations with your kids, this is still something that would be important for you to think about and take home with you. So one of the domains where the kids fell into the vulnerable range in the developmental assets was positive identity. So it fell in the vulnerable range for high school and in the adequate range for middle school. But in the adequate range for middle school, just barely. We're talking about a 0.3% above vulnerable. So let's talk about the good things that we saw in this particular domain. Kids both in middle school and in high school feel good about themselves. with middle school students, about 77% of them saying that they feel good about themselves most of the time. And high school students, about 69% saying that they feel good about themselves most of the time. They feel good about their future, and they're thinking about their purpose in life. So some of the bigger questions that we want our kids to start to think about is they're planning for their future. It's really good to have kids that are future-oriented. Now, let's talk about the things that we need to sort of take home and think about how we want to address with our kids. We have about 35% of high school students that said that they do not feel in control of their lives and their future. And we'll go more into strategies about how to have conversations with your kids about this. And it makes sense that you would actually see an increase in number of kids that say that they don't have control over their lives when you take a look at middle school compared to high school, because this is actually a developmentally appropriate task. As kids get older, they want to have more control over their lives. So one of the things that we'll talk about is how do we help kids feel more in control of their lives, and why is that important? But the main takeaway from the positive identity data that we would want you to walk away with, if we think about, that kids or people in general are using substances because they either want to feel good or feel better, this is where we want to focus our attention. 48% of our high school students said that they do not handle disappointment without getting too upset. So the question was, I can handle disappointment without getting too upset. 48% said never or rarely. So about 50% of our kids in high school are saying that they cannot handle disappointment without an excessive amount of distress. And we have about 38% of middle schoolers saying the same thing. This was one of the primary reasons why positive identity fell in the vulnerable range.
The next developmental asset that we're going to address is constructive use of time. And when we reviewed the survey data, we were a little bit confused to think about why this would be an area that Darien youth would show up as vulnerable in. And in fact, when the youth asset team was shown some of this data, they too came back and said, well, we think of our peers as being very active and engaged in both sports and clubs. So what came out of this? First off, there are a lot of really great strengths. For 90% of our high school and middle school students, they are involved in sports clubs or other kinds of groups. What was also really fantastic that came out of this is the majority of our high school and middle school students are self-reporting that they have quality time that's spent at home with their parents. That means that they're engaged and that they are connected. So why did this show up in the vulnerable range, and why are we bringing this to your attention right now? First off, what tends to bring this data down, not only in our data, but also in other communities around us, was the bottom part, was involvement in a religious group. And in the area, in our community, children are self-reporting lower levels in high school and middle school of being involved or regularly affiliated with a religious group. The other area that kind of brought it down for our students was involvement in creative activities, arts, music, and theater. Now, why would this be important? For most of us in our lives, we get a sense of confidence, fulfillment, satisfaction when we feel really good or talented about something that we have, when we have a skill set that we can call our own. But what happens with your identity when all of your self-worth is put into one basket? I identify myself as the athlete. I'm the intellect. I may be the artist, the musician. I may be the student. What happens when things change? What happens when you get injured? What happens when you don't make the team that you thought you were going to make? You don't get the part in the play that you were really hoping for? What happens when you find out you really aren't as good as you might have thought you were? Or what happens to a lot of us in life? We lose the enjoyment of a certain activity because we've been doing it and all of a sudden it doesn't give us that fulfillment. What happens to our own set of perceptions and values when we've spent so much time identifying with one particular activity or club. And that is why we're bringing this to your attention, is because when that often happens, we're faced with distress or a challenge. And sometimes you hear the stories in the media of a child who was injured playing a sport and all of a sudden took kind of a wrong path down the road, and here's where the outcomes are. And while you do hear about those things, that's not what happens to most youth. But what does happen is they might feel a little bit of loss, and they may feel a little bit confused and not sure what direction to go. And they're going to need that support system to help them figure out what are the next steps. So what we were thinking from this and took away from that is the more that we can encourage our youth to experience a well-balanced set of involvement in a variety of clubs, activities, sports, we offer them an inherent opportunity to expand their interests, increase their peer group and connections, and what really matters most, and when we're talking about struggling down the road, is be able to find joy in a lot of different areas of their lives. Thank you. The next area that came up on the developmental assets that we wanted to bring to your attention was positive values. Now, just so you are aware that on the youth survey, this for our youth fell actually in the adequate range. In fact, there were a lot of strengths that came up. Our youth believe that they can stand up for their own beliefs. They have a solid sense of self-worth. They all report, not all, but the majority report being involved in the community. And they also describe themselves as developing good, healthy life habits. So all those are great strengths that our youth do feel that they have. However, there were some vulnerabilities and some takeaways that came away from this particular asset group. The first one had to do with the statement, "I say no to tobacco, alcohol, and drugs." This is going to resonate with the information that came up earlier. What is fantastic and really good news is that we have almost 50% of our high school students self-reporting that they abstain from using alcohol on a regular basis when it is presented to them. But on the flip side of that, the dichotomy of that is 37% of our youth are reporting that they never or rarely resist using when presented with the opportunity. So this is really consistent with what we're seeing on the survey use. And it also really suggests to us that there's a subset of our youth that could really benefit to develop supports and factors for resiliency that help on twofold. One is building better coping skills to manage distress and uncomfortable feelings. And the second is to help them foster kind of protective factors that allow them to delay onset of substance uses. The second piece was, I tell the truth even when it is not easy. So while the majority of our youth report that they are able to manage discomfort and addressing difficult situations, we still had 33% of our youths reporting that they find this extremely challenging. So how do we help them with this? The first thing that we need to be thinking about is to help our youth own the consequences of their actions, even when it is really difficult, or when it might be publicly embarrassing. The second thing, and if you have an adolescent at home, this will probably resonate with you, they need to feel that others will listen and be open when they take responsibility for their actions. I don't know how many times I hear teens reporting, "Oh, it doesn't matter if I tell them, they're just gonna say no anyways," or, "Oh, I'm just gonna get a 0, I'm not gonna bother turning it in." At the developmental stage they're at, they move very quickly to catastrophizing. They've decided that they can read everyone else's minds. They already know the answer. They've got it all down. What we need to do is provide an open and safe forum that if they can come forward with these difficult situations and they can tell the truth, that the person receiving that information is willing to hear them out first, to be open and listen before judging. And the third piece is we also need to instill in our youth that these situations are not the end of the world. Research very clearly tells us that teens are much more likely to make impulsive, rash decisions or engage in self-destructive actions and behaviors when they feel like there is no alternative. And as Jim talked about with the prefrontal cortex not being fully developed yet, a lot of times when they're put to the metal or held to something, they panic and they don't feel like there's an alternative. So what we need to do too is also offer them that sense of hope that yes, this feels really bad, but this too will pass, and here's what's going to happen next. And yes, you have to own this and deal with the consequences, but there are options moving forward. This teaches our youth at a very early age distress tolerance and provides them safe problem solving so that they have those foundations in place so they can develop positive assets throughout their lifespan.
So as we were taking a look at the data, we had asked Emily a couple of questions that we were hoping could be posed to a couple of different groups of students. So we had the youth asset team and the student governing board of the depot answer a few questions about the data. Was there anything striking or surprising about the data? Did they have any thoughts on how, for example, they deal with disappointment? And these were some quotes from some of this informal survey. So in terms of feeling in control, they said the younger you are, the less control you have over decisions. We think it's important for us to make these decisions for ourselves in order to mature. Having control over these decisions makes us understand that the future is a result of our own actions and that certain actions have consequences. On handling disappointment. So they said, many of us cope by talking out the problem or asking for help. Communication is the best way to cope with something unexpected. The best thing to do is to handle the situation in a positive way and realize that you can get through these setbacks. And then on speaking up. Often we feel like we have the confidence to speak up, but it is more the fear of disappointing others that holds us back.
So what do our youth need from us? We actually asked them, and we figured that they would be the best resource for us to figure out where do we go next. About positive role models. We have this abundance in our community of adults willing and ready to help our youth. So what did the students have to say? The first thing was that they were able to make an extensive and robust list of the role models in their lives, and there were a lot of positive attributes. They said that they're positive. They have acceptance of me for who I am. They always have my back, always there for me. They're kind and encouraging, and they encourage me to take risks. These same students, with their wonderful voices, also gave us some very thoughtful feedback about what they need from you and me. From there, we got some feedback about what they need now from parents. And what these themes were really consistent across the groups. They want positive reinforcement. There needs to be a balance between judgment and feedback, helping them grow, and just acceptance and encouragement. They talked about themes of support, love, and encouragement. They talked about keeping as parents, keeping realistic expectations. They wanted you to be open and be a good role model. In fact, one group interestingly wrote up there, don't live your life through your kids. I think we can all kind of think about that one. They asked for judgment-free outlets. Listen to what I have to say. Hear me. Validate my experience for what I'm going through right now, and let it be mine. They also, very interestingly, asked for clear ground rules. They asked for boundaries and expectations. They want to know what your family values are. When it came to teachers, the biggest theme that came through was the concept of understanding. Educators work with kids all day long. Many of them have been working with adolescents and youth for decades. They know what teens are going through. They know how they develop. They see them grow year to year. They see all the changes. But the perceptions from our teens are perhaps they don't understand the pressure that these youth feel at this time. They want them to be more understanding for that. They also brought up they would like their teachers to push their students but know their boundaries. In order to do that, there have to be relationships and connections that are built. They mentioned treating students more like adults than children. They're seeking that mutual respect back and forth. And they said, we'd like you to care more about our mental health. How are we doing? How are we handling the world today? And what did they say in terms of the larger community? Most of the feedback was pretty global and holistic. They're looking for encouragement and kindness, inclusiveness, and they, again, asked for more education regarding mental health. These themes and feedback are all developmentally appropriate and reflect that balance of wanting to be my own person and establish my own individual identity, and yet at the same time, I still need you. I still need your acceptance and your guidance, and every once in a while, I'm really gonna need you to put me in my place because I'm not sure how to balance that yet. So that's the feedback that our youth gave us on the framework for the developmental survey. So now, what do we want you to take away? What are our conclusions? We want you to walk away tonight with just a little framework for thinking about how to empower your child and help them foster these positive assets that are going to carry them through life. In this framework, Georgette and I are going to go over 4 C's. These are core competencies designed to build resiliency in our youth. They're based on research in resiliency, self-esteem, and the idea of a positive growth mindset.
So the first C is control. And specifically, we want to talk about locus of control. This notion that you as an individual are able to affect change on your environment, that the things that you do are able to improve your future, that in a way, you have control over your life as opposed to life happening to you, or that people do things to you, or the environment does things to you, and you are sort of a passive participant. So under control, and one of the things that came up during the survey is there's this developmentally appropriate desire to want to feel like you have more control over your life. Now that's a really difficult juggling act for parents in both trying to give greater independence and greater decision-making power to someone that you know their prefrontal cortex is not fully developed and they're not going to make always the best decisions. And yet the only way that they're going to be able to develop those skills is through practice. So in terms of strategies, and before we get into strategies, one of the things to think about is that we don't want to target for change what we don't yet understand. So when we think about strategies and the conversations that you have with your kids, what your child may need in terms of what they want greater control over may be very different than the child of the person sitting next to you. So the first step is to have a conversation with your child. To have a conversation about, you're getting older. I see how much effort you're putting into your activities, into your school, into your life. Are there ways in which you feel like you're ready and able to take more decisions or make more decisions in your life? Are there areas where you wish you could do that more? So for some kids, it could be as simple as, I want to be able to have greater decision-making power over what we have for dinner. And for other kids, it might be, I want to feel like I can select my classes and think about what I want to do for the weekend or my extracurricular activities. For each kid, it's going to be different. And the juggling act comes into play when thinking about how do you collaboratively make a decision about how much control they can have over some of these areas, but not giving them more control than what they are able to handle. And that is, to some degree, trial and error. And that, just like riding a bike, They will sometimes make decisions that are not necessarily the best decisions or the decisions that you would have made for them. But the same way when the kid is learning how to ride a bike, you don't take the bike away just because they fell off the bike, right? And one of the things to think about is that it's difficult to tolerate to see your kids struggling. It's difficult to see them making decisions that we feel maybe are leading them down the wrong path. And sometimes it's difficult, even if they make really good decisions, sometimes plans don't go the way that they hoped. Which kind of leads a little bit into the next C, this idea of competence. And these two things are very interrelated. Competence is this idea that I can do it. No matter what life throws at me, I can figure it out. I have the capacity to do it. And I'm not alone in doing it. So no one is expecting these kids to be able to do this on their own. That's definitely not the message. But the message that we want to convey as parents is that I know you can do it. I'm here to help you with whatever it is that you need, but I know you have it in you. And as we're trying to figure this out, more often than not, kids have a greater capacity to handle things than we think they do. Now, if we think back to the area where some of our kids are struggling is with distress tolerance. This idea that when I'm faced with disappointment, I can handle it without getting too upset. This is where kids are really struggling. Usually when you have kids that are struggling with that, you're dealing with children who are catastrophizing. They're going from 0 to 60, like, I will never get this, I will certainly fail. If I get less than an A in this test, I will never get into this university. They're literally going 0 to 60 in their head. And part of our role as parents, but also as community members, whether it's neighbors, whether it's teachers, it's also to say, this too shall pass. That perfection is not the expectation. And that these are feelings that you don't need to run away from. Because again, one of the ways that you run away from these feelings is through substance use. If we don't teach our kids to be able to tolerate the stress. And for us as parents, one of the most difficult things to tolerate is seeing our kid in distress. We have to learn how to tolerate their distress as well. So one of the first steps is to, when we see our kids going through something like this, one of the first steps is to not go into problem-solving mode. I know that as a parent, that is the first thing you want to do, because you want to make this better for them. Except that when they're thinking that their life is over, they can't problem solve. That is not something that their brain is not able to do that at that moment. What they need from us at that moment is to think about, how do we help you regulate? How do we get you back to a place where you are able to think clearly, able to feel okay, not run away from the feelings, but know that these feelings are okay and that they're transient. You will not feel like this forever. And to think about coping skills. It could be doing something with you, it could be going for a jog, it could be doing art, whatever it is that makes them feel better. And then once they're regulated, be able to come back to the table and think about, okay, so let's plan. And that as much as possible, I always tell parents, before they speak, always have the word wait in their head. And wait stands for, why am I talking? And just, as much as possible, let them sort of plan things out. Have them think about a plan of action, and you step in when you say, okay, how can I help? Is there anything that you need from me? So that they know that they're not alone, but they're also more likely to follow through on this plan because this was a plan that they came up with. And also it gives them this unadulterated pride in themselves and increases this capacity that, you know what, I can figure this out. Whatever life throws at me, I am able to figure this out and I'm not alone in it. And that, my parents have my back.
I'm going to take you through the last 2 C's. The first one is confidence. Confidence can be defined as I feel comfortable in my own skin and how I view myself in the world. For each person, that definition is going to be different. It can be closely tied to feeling competent, as Georgette just discussed, and capable, and is often tied with our own experience with our environment at a current time. And as we move through adolescence and through life, that's going to be very dynamic. It's going to change all the time. There's a quote that I took that I wanted to share with you by Joanne Deek, who writes on self-esteem, and I thought this was really powerful. Some kids are born with a lot of self-esteem, with a lot of confidence and competence, and they keep doing things to increase that. Some kids aren't born with much confidence and competence, and then they avoid things that would fill those vessels. So you have to counter that catch-22 and encourage them, and give them a smorgasbord approach of doing things that fill up those vessels of confidence and competence, and leads you to the best self-esteem. Parents can't change their child's self-esteem by their expressions of love. We want you to tell your children that you love them. We want them to know it and believe it. And that will help them while they're trying to improve their own self-esteem and self-confidence. But your words, your love alone is not going to change your child's self-esteem. It will help them, though, have the capacity and the capability to hang in there until they've developed their own. So how do you as parents, how do we as a community help our kids develop self-esteem and confidence? We encourage them to take risks and try different things, even when they don't feel that they can do it. We allow our children the space to fail and then to get back on their feet. Failure is probably one of the most critical, important factors to developing a strong self-confidence. Teach your child to be an advocate for themselves. Teach them early to be independent in the house and the community. Teach them to be assertive. Teach them how to make eye contact with other people, how to talk to adults and others in the community, and how to be assertive and get their needs met. The key word there is teach. These are all skills that need to be learned. And the last piece to developing self-confidence is the ability to identify when you're feeling stressed and overwhelmed. As parents, the very first thing we can do is help our youth label the feeling and then validate that how they're feeling is okay. Then the next thing we need to do is be able to encourage them to solve the problem by themselves first. If that doesn't work, help them generate strategies that might help solve that problem, but ultimately encourage them to make the final choice about what plan they're going to take. That's where the failure piece comes in. Sometimes we find out we had the most brilliant decision and it worked really well, and sometimes we just fail. It turned out miserably, but that too is part of the process to develop confidence. And the last thing you can do as parents to help them build their confidence is listen to their opinions and respect their decisions. The final competency that we want to talk about tonight is connections. Connections are truly important. To feel valued in the world, you need to feel connected. It's important for all individuals to feel connected both to their peers, to adults, as part of, I'm visible in the larger community. In the early years, parents take care of a lot of this. In fact, most kids, their relationships are built upon parent participation. And on top of that, it starts to get bigger as they get older. Then it's maybe some activities you're in or the school that you go to. But as children get to be adolescents, their web widens. And we know that too through social media. Their connections can change and broaden much larger than we would ever want or hope for them to happen. But when you look at the literature on mental health and mental wellness, there's such a strong correlation between feeling connected and visible in your community and overall mental wellness. So we need to do certain things as parents to help foster our children to learn those skills. Build communication skills. Communication starts at home. Talk to your child and communicate with them daily. Do you know how your child's day was? Who are they spending time with? What makes them tick? What makes them feel good? Make sure that your child knows that you value their thoughts and ideas. One thing that we need to do is teach our children how to have relationships with peers and teachers. For some kids, this occurs organically, but for others, this needs to be explicitly taught and supported. We need to teach our children empathy and to think about how others are feeling. It occurs when we start teaching and modeling how to build a friendship. And once we know how to initiate and make friends, how do we maintain those friendships? That's all the foundation for building connections. It takes time and energy. The last two areas that are really important in terms of connections are teaching our youth community engagement. They talk a lot about wanting to be included in the community. They want encouragement and support. One of the skills that we need to teach them is how to reach out and make connections in the larger community. When you go into the local store, do you know who the owner is? Can you say hello? We all live really busy lives this day. There's not a lot of time to be able to make those connections. We have to make an effort as parents to foster and teach those skills. And the last area is to empower our children to build relationships with their teachers. As part of the youth asset team, they said, we want teachers to push us but know our boundaries. If our children have not made a unique connection with their educators, those educators are not going to be able to help them to support that. So we need to teach them how to send that email, how to go in early in the morning and ask questions. We need to teach them how to find ways to connect with those role models that are so available in the community. So in conclusion, those 4 C's is a good framework for you to be thinking about how can we continue to build the developmental assets that provide protective factors for our youth as we move forward. And our final slide, as I'm sure you guys are getting ready, where do we go from here? So we had talked about working on building positive role models. We talked about empowering students to have confidence in their voice, providing more opportunities to be connected to the communities. But what our youth told us most is that they would like the adults in our community to be more aware of the mental health that is affecting our adolescents. The youth said that there's this feeling that it's best sometimes just to keep things bottled up. We want you to take away that it's so important to listen and be aware of what is happening with your child. They feel like they're under a lot of pressure from a variety of places: sports, home, school, peers, and general development. Do I fit in? Where am I going? Can I handle this? Am I ready to handle this? Encourage them and teach them healthy ways to deal with stressors. They're watching. Help them deal with the consequences of poor decisions. We've all made them, and we've all survived, and we're here on the other side. Talk to them about the mistakes you've made on your journey. And what they also said to us that really resonated with me was set the tone that it's okay to be different, and it's okay to feel bad. Give them permission to have these experiences, and then we'll figure out what to do next. Don't wait until there's a crisis. Don't wait until you're sitting there with a problem in front of you. Step out, access the resources, know what's available for you, and if you don't know the answer, and I think there are a lot of amazing parents out there that are using all the resources they have, talk to someone else, because someone else will help you figure out the next step as to what to do. The best outcomes for youth happen when the support systems are in place. We can alleviate a lot of mental health distress down the road.
Now I'd like to open it up to questions.
You couldn't have thrown me a lob or anything, John? Yeah, no, that, I would say you have to tailor your intervention based on your relationship with your child and the child's relationship with drugs, first of all. But there are kids that are not comfortable in their skins because their parents are not comfortable in their skins. And there's a lot of research that suggests, for instance, affluence is actually a risk factor, not a protective factor, and that there's a direct correlation of a mom on medication and high-risk behavior for their daughters. Here in Fairfield County, Sonia Luther did that study years ago. There's a lot that we have to consider, but again, we want to meet each kid where they're at. We meet each family where they're at, not with judgment, because there's a lot of families that have troubles that are obvious if they struggle with their own substances, but then there's more insidious issues that was brought out by my colleagues of parents that are basing their relationships on who they want their kids to be versus who their kids are. And we did a focus group in Westport, and that was one of the things that came out a couple of years ago. Is kids just wanted to be accepted for who they were. And do their parents have reasonable expectations? Are they putting undue amount of pressure on them? And I do think that we have to lead by example. When was the last time we ran had a party that didn't have alcohol, non-alcoholic party, right? Right, Amy? Amy was always a big fan of that. We sometimes wouldn't even consider that. Or we come home from work and we're really stressed out. Do we go right for a drink, or do we say, wow, I had a stressful day, I'm going to go for a walk? Or a family meal, which, by the way, used to think they think that was a protective factor. And in my private practice, I've actually had a family come in one time where the boy was impaled with a fork during the family meal. So again, it assumes that not all families get along well. But the next family meal, instead of saying, hey Tara, how was that algebra test? How'd you do? Oh, I did fine. Say, hey Tara, let me tell you what an ass I made of myself today at work. It was the most embarrassing thing that I've done in a long time. I had this meeting and I fell back on the cord and fell down. I was so embarrassed. Then you're more likely to have an authentic conversation with Tara saying, well, you think that was embarrassing, Dad? You should have seen what happened to me last Tuesday in the locker. So lead by example. And I do think that, we talk about these settings where people are preaching to the choir, right? But again, you're preaching to the choir so the choir can speak off the rafters and send the message out there that there's hope and faith. And meeting your kid where they're at is really no judgment. You walk away with new understanding, love, and compassion. You're meeting your kid where they're at. You meet a family in the community where they're at, the same thing. No judgment, just love and compassion and new understanding, and try to be there to help. There's a lot of families dealing with a deep sense of shame and a lot of secrecy. And as they say, you're only as sick as your secret. So we want to give those families that you mentioned, John, that are struggling, permission and access to be able to give them hope and faith that there's resources in the community, there's help, and that they can talk about what's going on because they're not alone.
I can talk a little bit about that. There has been a big curriculum push across a lot of the districts in Fairfield County to put in what they call social emotional learning, and it hits on all of these factors that deal with resiliency. It works on, and actually, the curriculums, if you look at them as they're designed, start at a very young age, starting to teach empathy skills. They start with teaching kids very supportive self-regulation factors. They start to teach coping skills and how to manage stress. And then the curriculum continually gets more sophisticated to support students. I know, and I don't know if there's anyone here on the Board of Ed from the school district, that there was some conversations about trying to bring some more formal social emotional learning into the district, but I don't know in Darien where we are with that right now.
The one thing that we do know is that you need to start early. If you start the conversations around distress tolerance and coping skills when you're in middle school and high school, it's too late. It's never too late to do it, but that is not early enough. And we have focused so much on trying to have our kids be competitive academically at earlier and earlier ages that we think of school readiness in terms of, can they read? Can they add? Can they do all this multitude of things that are academically based, when what research is showing is that it's the social emotional skills that actually lead to greater academic performance. Because if you're not getting along with your peers, if you can't focus, if you can't regulate enough to be able to attend to what someone is telling you, you're not going to be able to succeed academically. And these are the things that we should be focusing on instead of trying to make sure that our kids are reading at earlier and earlier ages.
Reduce the stress. There's a direct correlation, by the way, nobody's going to want to hear this, but the drinking rates that are out of control here, there is research that's pretty compelling that would say that the excess drinking rates in the community for youth parallel and mirror the drinking rates of the adults in that same community. I'm not saying everybody out here is smoking marijuana, but to my colleagues' points, I don't know if our youth are dealing with enough self-regulation, mood regulation skills, and marijuana is an anti-analytic short-term, won't work for them long-term, and it'll turn on them and actually get them more anxious, but short-term, it works. It's also just like vaping. It's a sense of mindfulness that people don't even recognize. You know, you're actually consciously breathing. There's a lot healthier ways to do that, but there's not much to their disposal. So there's a lot of factors involved. Right, Emily? You want to jump in there? No? Yeah. Probably like some significant Amazon stock or something, but I do think you're on to something, and it wasn't mentioned today, and I didn't get to show that slide. Emily pulled that slide out. Thanks a lot, Emily, but, you know, we're still friends. I had a slide on the dopamine and its relationship to social isolation. We all do what we do because of our dopamine kick in the brain. It's what gives us a sense of reward. What you created in your family was an incentive that had value to you. So we need to find out what are the incentives that have value to our youth and empower them. It's not bribing them. It's earned rewards that actually is a dopamine kick. I mean, our biggest dopamine release pump in our society today is our cell phone. It's intermittent reinforcement. It's all the kind of bells and whistles that go off to say, is this going to be a good text? Am I going to get a thumbs up or not? You know, all that is a dopamine kick, and it works. So find the dopamine releases so kids don't have to find dopamine releases later. That slide I was going to show is a primate slide that showed the dopamine that was in a primate's brain, while two brains that were caged primates that when released in a setting, the dominant primate that felt valued, lovable, capable, and connected, their dopamine in their brain lit up like a Christmas tree. But the subordinate primate that didn't make any connections and were marginalized in a group setting might as well have stayed in the cage. So I say that because the family is the first level of the community. And where are you giving your child the opportunity and agency to feel lovable, connected, and capable in that first community? If they can't find that at home, to John's point earlier, in a troubled home, we hope that we can surround them with the next layer of community, in their faith community, in the school, in the community at large in Darien. And if we marginalize kids, for instance, with learning differences, all we're doing is hardwiring their dopamine system to be decreased, which will result in depression and substance use disorder. Something else I didn't even mention tonight that didn't make it on any of the slides, benzodiazepine misuse. Pervasive, especially in colleges. There's a college here in Fairfield County that just did a study to show that it wasn't stimulant use, which was the most prescribed or most misused drug. It was Xanny bars, as they call it, Xanax use. So Xanax and Ativan and all these benzodiazepines are being misused with alcohol and can be lethal. And it's starting in high school again because it's an anxiety medication and kids are not comfortable in their own skin. And then in college, when kids are drinking on this, it could be life-threatening. So something else. It's a whole nother talk we have to give, but just something to increase awareness. But incentives are the solution. Use the carrot, not the stick. There's compelling research that sticks work for some kids want that stick, but all kids, if you find the right incentive for them and tailoring it to what's appetizing and incentivizing for them and empower them to come up with those incentives that you can agree on, it always works.
And I would just add to what you're saying, I completely agree on the incentives, but at the same time, you've got the carrot out there. You have to be teaching other replacement behaviors so that intrinsically they can find other ways to find that pleasure for themselves. And that's why we're encouraging exploring all sorts of different kinds of activity. I don't know how many adolescents I see when I say, well, what do you do for fun? And they kind of look at me quizzically. Right? Well, that's not part of my day. And I said, well, think about, what do you do just to relax? And they really can't come up with a list of activities because they haven't taken the time to really find other things that bring them joy, that bring them a release, that give them that excitement. And when you don't have something else to use for that, guess what? You're going to be a lot more likely to go to substances to give you that feeling.
And I think also to think about not just incentivizing, but thinking about what is driving the substance use. So if we think about one of the top 5 reasons or 4 reasons why kids are drinking, one of them was to reduce their stress, to feel better. And so what is going to be more rewarding than not being in distress all the time? So there's going to be few things that might motivate a kid who's feeling that way, because the only thing that feels good is being drunk or being high. And so then taking a look at what might be driving the substance use as well, while also thinking about how to incentivize them in other ways.
And the greatest gift a father can give to his children is to love their mother, and the greatest gift a mother can give to their children is to love their father. This is where they'll learn intimacy. If they can't believe their own flesh and blood can be there for them, then they'll chemically simulate intimacy with drug use. And so it's something to look at. What does it mean for single mom or dad? Get a life. Outside your kids, kids only have 2 jobs: to receive love and learn. And you don't want to impose their ability to have to take care of you. No, you want to show a good life. You want to give them a sense that there's joy in the future, and that's what'll keep their world safe. And you want to launch them on with the belief that you have faith in them, not that you trust every decision they're going to make, because unless they're wearing a cape or something, they're not going to read your mind and your wisdom of all your life experience. Have faith that they're going to learn from all their life experience, and send them that message when you launch them on.
And we have time for one more question.
I don't think we have access to that information. I think that's an excellent question in terms of what is happening narratively around that. The only information we had in these surveys was the parent response to the questions. So I can't speak for you guys, but I don't think that you guys actually had access to any other sort of anecdotal data, correct?
Yeah, it's a bit incriminating. Literally.
Perhaps just as
could
we
be.
had these wonderful youth that we wanted to have youth on the panel tonight, and then we thought, well, that might be a little bit uncomfortable to direct all these questions at adolescents that then have to speak for their peers. So we decided to run these focus groups, and they were so forthcoming and insightful with what they shared that really that helped shape how we could share with you what do we need to do moving forward. So perhaps as one of the next steps, Randy, one of the things that we can think about is speaking to some parents anonymously, to find out, what do you think about this? And have you ever been in that situation? And how do you think that organically comes together? Because I think that might be helpful information.
My last comment for parents: go home and ask your kids, what am I doing well? What am I doing poorly? What do you like most about a relationship? What do you like least about a relationship? And by the way, do you feel you can tell me anything and know that no matter what you tell me, I'll always love you? Put yourself out there. Lead by example.
Just wanted to give another huge thank you to the panelists for coming tonight, but also give them the opportunity to speak on behalf of their organizations.
Yeah, I'll be quick. I'm excited to be part of Liberation again. I feel like I'm coming home. I had been part of Liberation years ago, and I just can't wait to be back in this community. I love the work I did at Mountainside. I'll still collaborate with them, but I'm really excited to be back in Liberation. In fact, we had a Darien youth option in Liberation when I was here last. I don't know what happened, but we still want to talk about being able to open access to treatment and prevention in Darien. And Darien was the first city in Connecticut that started Fathers Forums many years ago, and I'd love to see that introduced again.
So I am part of the Child Guidance Center of Southern Connecticut. We have been around since 1954, serving children and families in Greenwich, Stamford, Darien, and New Canaan. We provide outpatient psychotherapy services, medication management, care coordination. We also have a child advocacy center that provides a child-friendly setting for forensic evaluations of children who have made a disclosure of abuse. If you are interested in any of our services, we have brochures out in front, and we are very grateful that a lot of our work is actually thanks to the Community Fund of Darien and their continued support. So we really appreciate that.
Oh, I don't have an organization. Kind of a standalone.
Well, thank you all again for coming tonight. I hope you have a great rest of your night.